Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to the Football Law Talks. Today is talk number 3. Same as last time, you can follow us on English, French, or Spanish. And to interact with our speaker, please use the Q&A functionality of Zoom to send in your questions during the presentation. Our speaker will answer all the questions afterwards. Today's talk is all about financial fair play in football, an overview of models and CAS jurisprudence. And who better than Mark Hovell, head of sports and CAS arbitrator, an experienced player in the industry, top lawyer, and CAS arbitrator with great expertise, to join us today. Good afternoon, Mark, and thank you for spending some time with us on this Friday afternoon. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Maya. Absolute pleasure to be here. Very privileged today to be speaking to you on FFP in football, looking at some of the models that deal with financial regulations in football, and obviously touching on some of the CAS jurisprudence that I've been involved with, but also a number of my colleagues have over the years. So today we're going to look to give you a very brief history of financial fair play. It's a huge topic, and we've got 30 minutes, so I will be brief. And CAS decisions, again, there's been dozens of them, so I'm just going to pick out a few of the key ones. Being an honorary Mancunian, having lived in Manchester since the mid-80s, I thought it was obviously appropriate today to talk really about the Manchester City case in a bit of detail. So we'll focus on that one. But I'm sure it's not been lost on everybody that it's been in the news over the last couple of days that the financial fair play, certainly the UEFA level, is likely to undergo some changes. So I'll talk a little bit about the future of financial fair play. And that sort of leads me into talking about some of the alternatives, which may be on the table, that they may be considering. I think we've got to really consider COVID, because it's been a heck of a year for everybody involved in football. But football clubs have been decimated by the loss of revenues. So I think we have to talk about the COVID effect, and then I'll leave you with some final thoughts. And the idea really is to have some time at the end, possibly 20 minutes or so, for some questions and answers. And during the course, there's going to be a couple of polls as well. So when you are asked to, if you could cast a vote, that would be helpful as well. So, as I say, very, very quick history of financial fair play. The reality is, UEFA came up with this concept back in 2009, when its ExCo approved the principles of it. And in 2010, the regulations were added to the licensing program that UEFA have, which deals with clubs that want to play in their competitions, so the Champions League and the Europa League. So we've had a decade of these regulations. So I'm assuming that everybody's fairly well versed in them. The latest version of them came out in 2018, and there were amendments last year to deal with COVID in specific terms. But just to start with, really, I think it's worth going right back to the beginning and looking at the objectives of financial fair play, because you'll note that there's nothing in these objectives at all about making the Europa League or the Champions League more competitive, about trying to give the small teams a fist of it, if you like, against the bigger teams. This is all about financial sustainability. It was talking about improving the economic and financial capability of the clubs, looking to protect some of the key creditors of clubs, in particular players, other clubs, the tax authorities, looking to bring more discipline and rationality into football finances, and to encourage responsible spending for the long-term benefits of football, and really to protect the long-term viability and sustainability of European club football. So as I say, the financial fair play regulations were brought in as part of the licensing procedure. So if you as a club have qualified on the pitch to play in the Champions League or the Europa League, you still have to match up with certain licensing requirements, and part of those is financial fair play. And these are governed by the Club Financial and Control Body at UEFA, which is split into two parts: the investigatory chamber, that's really there to oversee and check the clubs meet those licensing criteria and continue to meet the licensing criteria as the competition goes on. And then, much as the investigatory chamber can discipline clubs that are in breach of the regulations, they only can do that to a smaller level. If there are bigger breaches, bigger infractions, then they get posted up to the adjudicatory chamber to deal with sanctions. And what is it they're looking for? Well, there's a number of benchmarks, but the two we're going to focus on really are the overdue payables and the break-even one. The break-even one, the key one that's probably getting the most press these days. Can clubs live within their own means? Can they manage to match their footballing income with their footballing expenditure, as opposed to living on handouts from their owners? Now, as I say, there's sanctions if those benchmarks are breached, which are usually issued by the adjudicatory chamber, and the whole system is wrapped up within CAS. So there are appeals to the Court of Arbitration Court in Switzerland. Overdue payables, well, that's the definition. Payables are considered overdue if they're not paid according to the agreed terms. And as I say, it's sums that are due from a club to another club. So it could be transfer fees, loan fees, these sort of things. Sums that are due to players, typically salary, and sums that are due to authorities. Now, there can be exceptions, and there have been cases around this. So there can be disputes between clubs as to what's due and what's not. So if there's a valid legal claim, then they're not treated as overdue at that time. You can get written confirmation from a creditor to give you time to pay. And again, if you have that time to pay, then that debt is overdue. Break even is a bit more involved. Effectively, we see here that clubs are looked at in terms of profit and loss. So you look at their income and you look at their expenditure. Are they making a profit or loss? You also look at it over a 3-year period. So the season you're looking at, you consider previous season and the 2 seasons prior to that as well. And you aggregate the profit and loss of the clubs, and they're not allowed to have a loss of more than €5 million. There's an exception to that in that the owners can bump that up to 30 million loss if they cover that by putting cash into the business. It's got to be capital introduced, not loans. And certain expenditure is ignored, disregarded. And this is actually to encourage investment by clubs. So investment in things like stadium, training ground, to the women's teams and the community teams and the youth teams, all good spending effects, as opposed to maybe spending on players and gambling a little bit on the pitch. And certain income is also ignored. The key ones are that the owners can't just prop clubs up by putting cash in themselves, and they can't try and put it through sponsorship deals where they're related to the sponsor. And if they overstate the sponsorship deal, which is with a related party, then UEFA could always restate the sponsorship deal to a fair value. Sorry, I'll go back on. So I'm just going to take a little break here, and we're going to have a poll. So I think my colleagues at FIFA can just bring up the first poll for us to look at. So as I say, feel free to start voting. It's going to be open for about 45 seconds. But a decade on, do you think that FFP has been an overall success? So again, it's not always easy to measure what a success is, but has it achieved those original objectives, those financial sustainability objectives? So as I say, hopefully you all have seen and heard of Financial Fair Play, so have a view. So please do vote. I can't, I'm afraid. So I think we've got a few more seconds to cast your votes before the results will pop up. So mixed, really, isn't it? Interesting to see that it's almost identical between people saying yes and no as to whether or not it's been a success. Now, so we can just close the poll off. So I'm very much in the yes camp. I think when we actually, when you consider what the state of European football was like when these regulations came in to what it is today, or certainly what it was pre-COVID, there's been a transformation in the health of European football. Back in 2010, 2011, what you're seeing here actually is a huge sort of profit and loss account of European football. It's taking all the income of all the clubs in the top leagues of the 55 members of UEFA and comparing it with their expenditure. And you can see that they were spending roughly 1.6, 1.7 billion euros more than they were making. That's a huge loss, huge deficit. Now, how's that made up? Well, owners could obviously inject some money in themselves, and that may have accounted for a few hundred million. But really, the rest of that gap was made up of clubs going bust, going into bankruptcy or some form of administration, and effectively creditors not being paid, whether that's creditors within the football ecosystem, so the clubs, whether it's players, or whether it's trade creditors, people who are supplying goods and services to football clubs. So not good for the football ecosystem and not good for the reputation of European football either. So just by putting these regulations on the table, we saw a gradual improvement. So much so that by the time we got to 2017, the profit and loss account has swung the other way. And the overall picture was that clubs in aggregate were making huge profits. COVID will have had an effect. We only have the data up to 2018, and it may well be that we start to go back into the red. But the very fact of putting these regulations on the statute book has improved the health of European football 1 billion over a decade. And it's not just in terms of profit and loss. The other main indicator that we're looking at was overdue payables. And this had a very quick turnaround as well. The first year, when these regulations came in, the clubs that made it into the European competition, Champions League and Europa League, had roughly 60 million of overdue payables, so sums that they hadn't paid to their fellow clubs, to the taxman, or to their players. Within a year, that had halved, and within another year, it dropped down to 9 million. The latest stats are that in 2019, the amount of overdue payables, 2 million euros. So what we're seeing is that clubs pay their key debts within the football ecosystem a lot quicker than they were doing right back in 2011. So again, another success, I would say, and another tick in the box for the objectives. And how about investments? Well, again, I'm probably a bit biased here because this is Manchester. And what we're seeing there is Manchester City, who took over and developed the old Commonwealth Games Stadium. And then they built next to it a nice stadium for the women's football and massive training facilities for all their teams, their youth teams, first teams, women's teams. They even built an educational college. They spent hundreds of millions in a particularly poor area of Manchester and have totally transformed that area. But that's just one club. There are clubs right across Europe that have now moved to their own stadiums, that have actually started to invest off the pitch, because all this investment off the pitch can help them generate funds that they can use on the pitch. And this is the responsible spending that UEFA want to see. What UEFA want to see is Manchester City and its youth team generating its talent, so that some of those talented players like Phil Foden to this world make it into the first team, as opposed to all clubs having to go out and spend the 100 million buying other people. And we've also seen what I call the trickle down and a little bit of the trickle up as well, because UEFA's financial fair play regulations only affect those clubs that are going to make it into the Champions League and the Europa League. But now what we've seen across the 55 members of UEFA is that almost all of them have their own form of domestic financial fair play. In fact, most of them have gone to some form of licensing. And we've seen some movement up the way as well, because FIFA have amended their RSTP to introduce their own regulations that tackle overdue payables. So on the whole, I would say, actually, FFP has been a great success. And when you measure it against its own objectives, UEFA's own objectives, you could actually tick the vast majority of those off. Now, the CAS has played its part. Certainly over the years, there's been dozens of cases. You've got to know I'm not going to go through any or many of these at all, but the regulations, UEFA's regulations and some of the domestic regulations have been well tested and challenged at the CAS. And the CAS has helped shape, this jurisprudence has helped shape some of those regulations. What you're seeing here are the references to the overdue payable cases. What I'm going to move on to now, these are the references of the break-even cases that I could find at CAS. And sort of two things jump out at me from this slide. Although you can't see the names of the clubs, there was a lot of talk at the beginning of UEFA's financial fair play regime, whether or not UEFA would actually have balls, I suppose, no pun intended, to take on some of the really big clubs in Europe. And these cases involve clubs like Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester City, AC Milan, Galatasaray, some of the larger clubs. So UEFA have not been worried about who they're taking on. If the people breach their break-even requirements, then they will take through the adjudicatory chamber and onto CAS if necessary. But the other thing that stands out from here is the number of settlement agreements there have been. And you really see that UEFA have used the carrot and stick approach. So they can sit down with clubs and they can say, well, we think you're in breach, we can take you through hearing regime, we can take you to the adjudicatory chamber, and we can take you on to CAS, and we will seek sanctions at this sort of level. Or we can sit down and we can talk. We can actually try and give them lesser sanctions. They can try and agree fines, perhaps. They could try and help them work towards compliance, which help them with reducing their salaries, reducing their squad sizes, and try and make sure that they actually meet the regulations going. And in the vast majority of cases, these settlement agreements have been incredibly successful and have actually enabled clubs to start to live far better than their means. And for those of you that are interested, go on to the CAS website. There is a database section there, and there's a search engine. And if you type in financial fair play, surprisingly, it will come up with a good number of those cases if you need to read them or do some further research. But it's not all being plain sailing for UEFA. I mean, I think in a way they've been a slight victim of their own successes, because as they've ticked off a number of those objectives, then people are left looking at the regulations and looking at some of the effects those regulations have. So some people say, well, haven't they led to fossilization? Doesn't it just mean that the richest clubs, the biggest clubs, get bigger and richer and have more success? Because effectively these regulations stop a new owner coming in and investing heavily and trying to, I suppose, do a little bit what Manchester City did and what Chelsea did. A new owner with a lot of money enables them to move up to the top of the league and challenge the old order. Doesn't this stop that? Isn't that anti-competitive? Are they subject in themselves to a risk of being challenged through the EU courts as opposed to through the sports court? And ultimately, some people are asking, well, who are UEFA? Why should they try and stop people investing in sport and in football clubs? So there's been some pretty high-profile cases, and probably no more so than the Manchester City saga, if you like. Now, this long-running dispute, it's between Manchester City and UEFA, which came to a conclusion last year, ran for over 6 years. For those of you that know the English legal system, we have solicitors like me that work at solicitor firms, and we tend to work hand in hand with barristers who will do the advocacy in cases or at tribunals. And the top echelon of the barristers are called Queen's Counsel, QCs. In this 6-year battle, I saw that there were 3 QCs. There were a number of other barristers. There were 5 external legal firms, solicitor firms, across the globe, and that's on top of the 2 in-house legal teams that got involved with this dispute. There was probably millions of euros, millions of pounds spent in legal fees all the way through this case. So a hard-fought battle. Now, it started in 2014 when UEFA felt Manchester City were not going to be compliant with the break-even requirement that year, and they effectively opened an investigation, and that ended up in a settlement agreement between City and UEFA. So there was no acceptance of breach of any regulations, but there was an acceptance of €60 million fine by Manchester City, albeit 20 million of that was payable, 40 million of it was conditional. So if Manchester City could become compliant in future years, then they would pay that remaining 40 million. And in order to help them, I suppose, become compliant, they agreed to reduce their overall salaries to players. They agreed to have small squad sizes for European competitions. They agreed to reduce the deviations. And that settlement was a success. By April 2017, UEFA informed Manchester City that they'd complied with the terms of the settlement agreement, and the regime was over. So it looked like everything was done and dusted, because by that stage, Manchester City had continued to grow. Indeed, all Premier League clubs had continued to grow because of the huge broadcasting deal that the Premier League enjoyed. But also Manchester City's commercial income had grown. You can see that they'd extended their stadiums, so their match day revenues had grown as well. So they were now in a position to obviously spend more on the pitch, but they could balance the books. They break even. But the problems occurred in November 2018, when there was an illegal hack on Manchester City's computer servers. And various emails were taken from that and then were leaked to the press, and press organisations like Spiegel printed some of those emails in the press, so that they found themselves in the public domain. And UEFA, as a regulator, obviously has a duty to consider that type of information that was in the press. And they opened a second investigation in March 2019. Now, from that investigation, the investigatory chamber decided to refer the matter and Manchester City to the adjudicatory chamber, believing there were sufficient breaches that meant that it should be sanctioned by the adjudicatory chamber. Now, before that referral decision was even passed to Manchester City, that appeared in the press, so there were more leaks. And Manchester City asked UEFA if they would pause the entire process to get the leak. The investigatory chamber said, well, it wasn't them, and there was no need to pause, so matters should just go on to the adjudicatory chamber. Manchester City then brought a case to CAS, which is the 6298 case, and they were really asking to have two decisions appealed. One was the referral decision itself, and the other was this refusal to pause the process to try and get the possible press leaks. So the matter went to CAS, and the matter turned largely actually on the CAS code rather than on the regulations themselves. It was Article 47.1 of the CAS code, which applies to all parties that bring appeals to CAS. Effectively, you have to have exhausted all other internal legal remedies before you trouble the CAS with the appeal. And what UEFA was saying here was that City should have actually taken the matter, the underlying dispute, to the adjudicatory chamber. The adjudicatory chamber itself could have dealt with looking at the leak if needed to, and then it would have issued a final decision and sanctioned Manchester City or not, saw fit. And if it did sanction them, then, and only then, could Manchester City bring the case to the CAS. And the CAS itself looked at the procedural rules of UEFA around the financial fair play, and they said, well, actually, there are some decisions that the investigatory chamber issues that can be seen as final decisions that would go straight to CAS. But a referral decision to the adjudicatory chamber is not one of those, and that was pretty much in line with the decision that had been taken against AC Milan the previous year. So effectively, this appeal was premature, it was inadmissible, and the matter needed to go back, needed to go on to the adjudicatory chamber. That's what happened. The adjudicatory chamber then dealt with the matter, and in February 2020, I think it was actually on Valentine's Day, they issued their decision to Manchester City in Valentine's Day with love. And they decided that they were going to ban Manchester City for the next 2 years of the Champions League, and they were going to give them a €30 million fine. That fine being for failing to cooperate properly during the investigation process. So, needless to say, that decision then came back to CAS as it was appealed in case 6875. Now, I've just tried to set out there for you a little bit the, if you like, the corporate structure of Manchester City. And you can see the ultimate beneficial owner, I suppose, is Sheikh Mansour, who, through his investment company, ADHG, owns about 86% of the City Football Group. Now, the City Football Group actually has football clubs in America, in Australia, South America, Spain, Japan, literally I think most parts of the world these days. But one of its entities that it owns is the Manchester City Company, which in turn owns Manchester City Football Club. And the emails that we talk about, the emails that ended up in the press that were illegally obtained from the servers at Manchester City and ended up in Despicable, they really purported to prove that there were payments made by ADHG to Manchester City Football Club via the sponsors, so via Etihad and via Etisalat tickets. And those were to the tune of about €200 million. And these were done allegedly in 2012 and 2013. Now, as you recall from what I told you a little earlier, it wouldn't be possible for ADHG to just invest 200 million in Manchester City Football Club, because Manchester City Football Club, under financial fair play rules, to survive on its own income, not on its owners' income. But if Manchester City was to go out and get sponsorship deals with the likes of Etihad and Etisalat that added up to €200 million, then that would be treated as its own income, its own commercial income. So the allegations that were effectively brought before the adjudicatory chamber that they ultimately found were accepted was that ADHG had given the money to the sponsors, who had then paid it through sponsorship agreement to MCFD, disguise it, to effectively disguise equity investment as sponsorship. And this was totally denied by Manchester City. So the matter went before CAS, and we saw Manchester City appealing against those income and expenditure calculations and the allegations or the findings of the adjudicatory chamber that hadn't cooperated, it hadn't given full and honest disclosure. And CAS had to decide on a number of issues, and the first thing it had to decide on was whether or not those emails that had been illegally obtained and that were then put in the public domain by Legal, should they be allowed to be considered by the CAS? Manchester City was saying, look, these are illegally obtained documents, you shouldn't consider them. Well, the CAS had to sort of weigh that up, and I think they thought, well, actually, it wasn't as if UEFA had gone and hacked the servers and had got the information themselves that way. Somebody else had done that, Mr. Pinto, who I believe is currently residing in a jail in Portugal. He'd gone and done that. Once he'd put them into the public domain, then yes, it was for UEFA. It was fine for UEFA to rely upon those, and the CAS could as well. It's interesting actually that the criminal court, I believe, in Portugal, that sentenced Mr. Pinto, they did say in their judgment that these emails shouldn't be allowed to be used in other proceedings as victims of a pack, so against Manchester City. But CAS, when they weighed it up, it's about the interests of Manchester City and the interests of UEFA, decided that they would consider these emails. So they were allowed in as evidence. There was then also a secondary issue, was whether or not the settlement agreement that was concluded in 2017, did that effectively wrap up all the issues around break-even requirements and FFP requirements back in 2014. Effectively, had they all been served with settlement agreements, or could they in theory be revisited? The CAS decided, well, actually, they were different allegations, different breaches of the FFP regulations that UEFA were looking at here, as opposed to what went into the settlement agreement. So settlement agreements have no real effect. And then the third line of defence, if you like, was the statute of limitations. So within the FFP regulations, at Article 37, there's a 5-year statute of limitation from the prosecution of football club. So UEFA can't go back further than 5 years from prosecution. But what's prosecution? Well, that again was hotly debated. You can imagine Manchester City wanted to push that as far down the road they could. So they argued that actually prosecution was when the adjudicatory chamber gave its sanctions. UEFA, on the other hand, wanted to go as far back in time as they could. So they said, well, actually, prosecution is when the investigatory chamber did its investigation. The CAS said, well, both wrong. It's actually a bit more in the middle. It's when the referral decision was made. So the matter goes from the investigatory chamber to the adjudicatory chamber. That's more like when charges were brought. That's when the proper prosecution was. And that had the effect of saying that the CAS couldn't go back further than May 2014. Now, as you remember what I just said, the allegations from those emails were that the wrongdoing or any potential wrongdoing was done in 2012 and 2013. So UEFA said, well, actually, what we're looking at here is an aggregated situation. And in order to get the break-even calculation, you've got to go back 2 further seasons for any one season that you're looking at to get the aggregated position. So we should be able to bring in transactions that happened in 2012 and 2013 when we're looking at the situation in 2014. And on a majority decision, the CAS said no. The statute of limitations is fixed, it's a fixed date, and it's May 2014. So they weren't interested in looking at any statements that had been made in 2012 or 2013. And that effectively killed the case for UEFA. I think it's fair to say that Manchester City's witnesses performed very well and were believed, but ultimately CAS allowed the appeal. So Manchester City were free to play in the next 2 editions of the Champions League. The fine of 30 million for a failure to cooperate was actually reduced to just 10 million. Not just 10 million, it's still a lot of money, but it was reduced to 10 million. And that's how the case finished. Now, obviously, the press had a field day on this. It was, I think it was reported by people like the BBC in England that it was the death of financial fair play. See here what Jurgen Klopp and what Mr. Mourinho thought. I mean, Klopp, he said it was a good idea, but ultimately, if the richest clubs and countries can do what they want, then it makes things difficult. Mourinho said, well, I truly believe that FFP is gone. The circus is open. If they've opened the doors, everyone can just go in and do what they want. So I'm going to take another break. Second poll, if we could. What do we think? Is Jose right? Or the BBC right, has financial fair play gone? Is it dead? What do you think? Give sort of about 45 seconds just to press the button and see what we think. So I think we'll just sort of close it now and then get the results straight up. Well, there we go. So nearly 60% feel that was the death nail of financial fair play. Okay, so we could close that. Let's move on. I mean, the reality was actually the City case could have been very different. That was a majority decision. You know, if possibly just one different arbitrator could have had a different view, and it could have been that yes, you know, we'll allow. If we're looking at the position in May 2014, we do have to consider what went on in 2012 and 2013. But that's how it is. And some may wonder, why did UEFA even bother? I mean, Manchester City, you've got an owner like Sheikh Mansour, one of the wealthiest men in the world. He wants to put lots and lots of money into a football club. Isn't investment good? But I suppose the difficulty is it's not just about Manchester City, is it? I think for every Manchester City, there's probably about a dozen other clubs that have what on the face of it looks like a good owner. Comes in, promises to put money in, and sometimes even does put money into a club. But then the club gets used to living on the owner's money, not its own money. And what happens if that owner gets bored? What happens if actually the owner says, I want my money back? What happens if you get something like COVID comes along? That means that the owner can't really afford to put any more money in because his or her own business has gone to the wall, gone into bankruptcy itself because of being badly affected by COVID. But what typically happens then is that you're left with a football club that's got a lot of expenses, a lot of expensive players, that it's not bringing the income in to meet their wages. And they can go bust. They can go into bankruptcy. And that's why this is important to UEFA. That's why it's important to stakeholders in football. It's about financial sustainability. It wasn't really just a fight against Manchester City, and that's probably how it's perceived in the press. It's really about stopping clubs becoming too reliant on their owners' wealth when they can't manage without it. But you know, the other thing that's come on now is that if all these objectives have been met, you know, are UEFA and its financial fair play in its current form leaving itself open to a competition law so much? Now, are there other models that are out there that are perhaps a bit less restrictive that might replace financial fair play? And if we were to look at competition law, well, in European terms, regulations aren't allowed to restrict competition. They're not allowed to restrict the freedom of movement. So players, if you like, moving from country to country. And you can't have a dominant undertaking like UEFA using its position. These are allegations that were all made at different times by people in the press and indeed by some clubs against UEFA. And UEFA would say, well, no, these regulations can be justified, even if they are anti-competitive or even if they do have some restrictions. These are necessary to achieve a legitimate aim. What is that legitimate aim? Well, it's to bring financial sustainability to European football. But the problem is, for it to not fall foul of the European competition law, these regulations have to be an effective way of achieving that aim. And crucially, there can't be an alternative or less restrictive way of achieving that aim. So what are the alternatives that might be less restrictive? Well, people again will talk about salary capping. And salary caps come in different formats. You can have a hard salary cap, which would be something like football clubs can't spend more than 50 million euros a year on player wages. Now, does one size fit all? That's and what's the rationale behind such a regulation? You can have a soft cap, which might be, well, no football club can spend more than 70% of its income on player wages. You do see things like salary floors, which is all clubs must spend at least 60% of their income on player wages. You see things like luxury taxes. So if we had a soft cap in football that said you can't spend more than 70% of your income on player wages, but you won't go above that, but for every euro you spend on that, you have to put another euro into a pot over here, and that's the tax. So if you're a club that had ambitions and wanted to go beyond the 70% soft cap, and you wanted to go 20 million euros over that, well, you can spend 20 million in the transfer market and the players. You've got 20 million in one pot. Who holds that pot? Would it be UEFA? Would it be the local or the domestic federations? Who gets to share the proceeds of that pot? Is it clubs that are competing with clubs in the Champions League or the Europa League? Is it the clubs in the domestic league? Because one of those might have missed out on getting into the Champions League. And what proportions do you spend? Would you share it? Should the money just all be kept by governing body or by UEFA and spent on combating things like racism, on improving the women's games, things like this? What you actually do with it is very difficult and take a lot of time to debate. We do see in Europe already, there's some forms of financial regulation across each of the big leagues. So in England, for example, the Premier League do have controls on how much of the broadcasting revenue can be spent on player wages. They do allow club owners to invest in their clubs, and they allow more investment in the clubs than UEFA do. We see a number of the other leagues have budgets. So it's more about actually agreeing with a club at the beginning of the year. What's your cash flow forecast going to look like? How much cash do you need this year? How much income do you need to meet your expenditure? And working with them to make sure that they don't overspend during the course of the year. So it's a forward-looking type of arrangement, whereas a current financial fair play mechanism is looking backwards, looking back at aggregated losses over a 3-year period. A lot of these regulations are looking forwards, trying to actually work with clubs to help them stave off financial difficulty. Now, this year domestically, we had an example of the EFL, so the English Football League, and that runs the second, third, and fourth professional leagues. And actually, it had run the format of a soft cap for a number of years in League One. So it was basically that the clubs there could spend 60% of their income on player wages. They were also allowed to spend up to another 100% of that sum if the owner put the cash in themselves. But at the beginning of this season, they scrapped that and they went to a hard cap. And that was that no club in League One has spent more than £2.5 million on their wage bill. So that had an effect of sort of bringing some of the bigger clubs that were probably spending nearer 10 million a year down to the level of some of the smaller clubs. So was that more about balancing competition? Was it trying to get everybody on an even playing field so the smaller clubs could compete with the bigger ones? Or was it about suppressing wage inflation? Or was it about financial sustainability? It wasn't clear what the objective behind that was. But crucially, they also ignored the collective bargaining process in English football. So they didn't actually speak with the players about this. They just brought these changes in unilaterally. And the players' union took them to an arbitration and was successful. And that's resulted in the withdrawal of the salary cap rules. So there is no now that competition. Instead, the union and the league will sit down and negotiate and try and come up with some proper regulations that deal with financial sustainability going forward. capping on itself isn't unheard of. We do see it a lot in certain places, certain parts of the world. I mean, America is probably where we see it the most. And again, it probably has more of a place there, because if you think about American sports, they're closed. There is no promotion or relegation into the NFL, for example, or the NBA. There's a set number of clubs. And really, their objective is more about evening up. It becomes a better spectacle to watch for them if any club entering that competition could actually win that competition. So they do things like the draft pick. They give the best new players to the worst clubs. They share revenues. So the richest clubs have to give some of their revenues to the poorer clubs. They do have salary floors. So the poorer clubs can't just take that money and keep it. They have to invest it in players. And then there's usually hard-fought collective bargaining agreements between the unions and the owner. And effectively what it's saying is, okay, well, we're going to restrict the freedom of movement of labour, but we're also going to guarantee a percentage of the overall cake, the overall pot of money that this sport makes, and that's ring-fenced for the players. So it's all wrapped up in a detailed collective bargaining agreement. So it's not that salary capping doesn't have its place, it just takes a lot of work. So a lot of people just throw in salary capping is the answer, but it needs more thought, more negotiation, I think, and it needs to have all the stakeholders discussing it. So just to finish on one CAS case that did look at competition law, effectively, it was interesting that Manchester City didn't try and crash the system by alleging that financial fair play was illegal, but Galatasaray did run this. They argued that there were 5 grounds within the treaty for the functioning of the European Union, so like freedom of movement of capital and freedom of movement of labour, had been infringed. But they didn't make a particularly strong fist of it, I'm afraid, at the CAS. So they made the submissions, the allegations, but they didn't really back it up with any jurisprudence. They didn't really back it up with any expert evidence. You could expect expert economists and accountants to be brought before a panel to actually. So the CAS dismissed the case, and this is often seen as CAS saying that financial fair play is compliance with competition law. I'm not sure if this would bind a future CAS panel if a proper job was done with proper expert evidence, but time will tell whether it will be done or whether indeed it's necessary. Because you'll have seen, it was on Twitter a couple of days ago and it's been in the press today, that UEFA are now see it as the time to actually refresh financial fair play. Andre Traverso, one of their directors there, who's responsible for financial fair play, said that COVID effectively makes the regulations somewhat purposeless. And I think that's right, because clubs are measured on their revenues over a 3-year period, and their revenues over the last 12 months have just dropped off a cliff. The effect of COVID has been to deprive clubs of match day revenue, and it's had an effect on broadcasting revenue, it's had an effect on their commercial revenues. It's like clubs with huge debts, and clubs can't do what they traditionally do when they get into debt, is sell some players, because everybody else has debts, and everybody else is not in a position to buy players. So we've seen the transfer markets the last 2 windows, again, almost half. And quite often the owners have been affected by COVID as well. There are businesses that usually give them the wealth that they put into the football clubs have gone to the wall too. So we are going to see a new set of regulations. It's not clear when. I think they're just starting to engage in discussions, and it'll certainly be interesting to see if UEFA avoid the trap the EFL dropped into themselves by not just consulting with the European Commission, but also consulting with clubs and players, so presumably FIFA, because I think it's crucial that all the stakeholders say and what these regulations will look going forward. But with the effects of COVID, I think financial sustainability is perhaps as relevant today as it was 10 years ago when FFP first came out and when clubs were losing 1.6 billion euros a year. So I think version 2, financial fair play, is going to have a key role to play in the world of football. So with that, I'll shut up and say thank you. I think hopefully I've left some time for us to have some questions. I think Maya's going to come back and pose some of those now.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very detailed and interesting presentation. Indeed, we have received some questions, and I would like to already pass the first one to you. It's coming from a fan of ours, from Professor Steve Ross. He has been waiting for this talk, and he was already logged in for almost half an hour before. And he would like to know, why can't the market adequately protect creditors by providing more transparency about the club's financial situation and then allowing creditors to take the appropriate risk if a club's position seems insolvent?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I suppose most accounting information is always historic by nature. So anything that gets posted at Companies House, for example, in England, will already be 9 months out of date, and then it's looking back at the year from there. So if you're a creditor wanting to do business with a football club, you're working on very outdated information. I suppose the licensing systems that we see in some parts of Europe are a lot better because they're based on forecast information. And if a creditor could access that forecast information, then they'd be better placed to know whether or not to trade with a club. I suppose creditors could have a bit of faith in the domestic regulators if they know that these regulators are sitting down with clubs on a regular basis to try and keep them on track with those forecasts. If the objective is to try and keep them from going bust, then they've probably got an element of guarantee that these are going to be businesses that will stay solvent for at least the next season.
We have another one from Hugo, and he would like to know your opinion on improving competitive balance in European football, if you think that FIFA or UEFA should implement a form of a salary cap, in your opinion.
Well, again, this is the point, isn't it? It's what's the objective of the regulations? If the objective of the regulations is financial sustainability, then I'm not sure salary caps is the answer. Certainly not a hard cap. But if you're wanting to try and make it more competitive, then yes, there are different ways, as we've seen in America. You could share revenues better. And don't forget, most of the leagues will share revenues from the broadcasting deal, but they don't really touch upon match day revenues or commercial revenues. But I think a luxury tax is probably the best way if you're wanting to share revenues out more, because it means that the clubs that want to invest the most have to pay a tax for going above a certain cap, and then the other clubs, their competitors, get to share what goes into the tax pot, if you like, and then they get more money to spend. So it tries to even things up. As I say, it depends what your aim is. If your aim is to try and make this a more competitive model, then I'm not sure it's necessarily going to work when you've got an open competition, as we do in European and most of the world football, where we like the fact that clubs can rise from the bottom and raise to the top. If you close a competition off, then it's easier to bring in competitive regulations that try and make it fairer, so that any club can win the competition.
And another one, a viewer would like to know if you consider if establishing financial institutions and/or platforms under FIFA governance would provide for a better transparency when it comes to football transactions, meaning that all clubs will have no option but to deal within such a bank or platform.
well, FIFA are setting up certain platforms, the new clearinghouse and things like this, I think will hopefully lead to a lot more transparency, the improvements to the TMS system over the years. So it's not just dealing with international transfers, but also looking at domestic ones as well. We'll hopefully deal with more transparency as well. I'm afraid it's, over the years, it has been an industry where, payments do go under the table. There are, there's still corruption within the sport. So it's not that, the governing bodies, the domestic governing bodies, and indeed FIFA are not trying to tackle these types of things. I think it's quite the contrary. I think they're making great strides to try and make the sport a lot more transparent.
And here we have another one from Shebab Esad. He would like to know your opinion if putting an additional financial burden on a club who is already fined, does it become a burden on the PL of the club that needs to be paid through the club's income or profits?
It does. Yeah, I mean, there is some irony there, isn't there, that if you're struggling to break even, that you then have a big fine to pay as well. But I suppose are sanctions financial, or are they sporting, or is it a mixture of the two? If you just have sporting sanctions on clubs, then quite often they would see those as worse because it can stop future income streams. So if all clubs that fail to break even aren't allowed into the Champions League, for example, that stops their opportunity of actually earning prize money and broadcast money in the next season. So I think UEFA have tried to balance between the two over the years, and certainly in their settlement agreements, it's trying to actually sort of fine the clubs, but then also help them by, if you like, cajoling them to reduce their salary bill, to reduce their squad numbers. So it's trying to work with them and to try and, if you like, set out a blueprint as to where they can become compliant over, say, a 3-year period.
Thank you for that one. And now Rodrigo Robles would like to know if you have any idea or concept about the implementation and compliance about the FFP in South America.
That's a shorter one. No, less so. And I think I'm not sure I have much of an idea of what's going to happen exactly with back home in Europe either. I think it's, as I say, FFP is going to struggle dramatically over the next year or so because most of FFP is based on revenues and trying to get clubs to break even, or it's trying to get them to pay their debts. And the effect of COVID has just decimated these types of regulations. So I would hope, what we've seen in Europe and what I've seen in England is an amnesty against these types of regulations at the moment. And I would hope that something similar happens in South America and indeed right around the world, because you can't really be sanctioning clubs in this current environment. And if anything, it probably gives the regulators a year or so to look at what new regulation should come in to deal with the post-COVID world.
Excellent. Well done, Mark. It's 1 minute before 4. So right on time. That was actually our last question, coming from a colleague from South America. And thank you very much, really, for your presentation and taking the time to answer a few questions from our participants. We had around 200 following us today for this talk. And for those who joined us late or would like to watch it again, we are always uploading this on FIFAlegal.com. Hope to see you soon, Mark, in another event. And as we always say at the end of this event, hopefully next time we see each other somewhere in a real place and not only in these virtual platforms. Have a nice weekend, Mark, and hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And for all our followers and our fans of these football law talks, I'm very happy to inform you about our next talk. It's a usual suspect already, we can tell. He asked the first question today, and we will meet him on Friday, the 30th April Same time, same place, we will have Steve Ross, professor from the Penn State Law, and he will be here to talk to us about the U.S. model of sports, how the NFL and the MLB differs from the global football. Hope to see many of you in a little bit more than a month, and see you very soon. Enjoy the weekend and stay safe. Thank you.